Hello, other viewers of OutOfThisBinary. It's Timmie here. I hope you're having a lovely weekend. And here's the video I've been promising for a couple weeks where I am taking a look at the DSM-5 entry for gender dysphoria. So before I start this, I'd just like to say I completed my grad program yesterday, and I officially have a master's degree in teaching, and I'm super excited. We had a poster board presentation and celebration yesterday, just celebrating all our work that we've done, and it was a really great time. And the reason I'm doing this video is because I did two different projects to complete my master's degree. So one was an alternative project, and this was the second one that we did, and is what I did for the poster board presentation, that was really focused on anti-racist education. And maybe I'll talk about that on another fluffy week, because I ended up really liking that project as well. But I ended up doing a scrapbook about some anti-racist musicians that are actually very legit educators. So I talked about for the poster board, I talked about two different artists. One was this folk singer named Buffy Sainte-Marie, who's incredible. You should really go check her out. She's been fighting for Indigenous rights since the 60s through protest music, and she is still so alive and really resilient today. And then I also focused on a musician named Johnny Otis, who has a really inspirational story about being a Greek immigrant, and then his life story about basically holding himself accountable for white privilege and dedicating his life to public radio to advocate for the black community and for black politics. But the first project I ended up doing was a paper that was supposed to be on culturally responsive teaching, and so I made that paper all about just being a genderqueer role model in a public school setting, and so that was primarily drawing off a lot of my experiences from student teaching, and so I had a bunch of different evidence that I looked at for that. So one was an email I received from a parent regarding my gender nonconformity. Another was about interactions I was having with students and my difficulty with trying to relate to certain masculine norms that I was noticing within the classroom. I took a look at statistics regarding trans and gender nonconforming kids in school, and I also showed some evidence regarding certain interactions I was having with students that was representing of how we built relationships across my time during student teaching. But one of the pieces of evidence I used was the DSM-5 entry for gender dysphoria. So for those of you that don't know, DSM-5 refers to Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is the 5th edition, so DSM-5. So gender dysphoria can be defined as emotional, mental, and or cognitive dissonance towards one's gender assigned at birth. And so why I want to take a look at this. So the DSM-5 entry for gender dysphoria, it's an entry that still affects many of the lives of trans, non-binary, and gender nonconforming people today. Cases of gender dysphoria, it's the primary reason to lead someone to hormone replacement therapy and gender-affirming surgeries. So it can be a life-altering process that has the input directly from medical and psychological institutions, and I believe that's the primary reason it's still within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is basically, as I said, it's just an entry that's really impacted the lives of many queer people, and it's why I wanted to take a look at it for my paper. So with all that being said, here we go. I'm going to show just a few photos. It was scanned copies that I made of the entry. So to start with, something I was genuinely surprised of with first reading is just that there was a lot of newfound sensitivity to language and following where culture has gone surrounding their perceptions of gender identity. I was genuinely surprised by that in good ways. So for one thing to start with, the DSM-5 entry for gender dysphoria actually replaces what was the entry of gender identity disorder for the 4th edition of the DSM. And it establishes in this entry that being transgender shouldn't be conflated as the same thing as having gender dysphoria. So while the 4th edition, the former pathologized trans people as mentally ill and categorizing it as a disorder, the latter focuses on the feeling of gender dysphoria as the clinical problem, not the identity per se. And it acknowledges rightly that gender identity is not just psychological, but a mix of the psychological and sociocultural aspects that one is raised in. So yes, this is more sensitive, but I still question, like, is it really fair to call it a clinical problem? Is problem really the right word for it? Should it be more said like a condition? Is that a more sensitive word choice? If it is a problem, is it trying to implicitly question societal aspects instead of just blaming it on the individual, since it says the identity is not the problem? Anyways, more regarding what I liked in sensitivity in language is that this entry does validate gender outside of a binary. It states that gender atypical behavior or nonconformity is not the same as having gender dysphoria. It mentions the terminology of gender assignment. It mentions the connections to neurodivergence, correlations such as like autism. It says that it could also be used generally as a descriptive term, so gender dysphoria, as well as for diagnostic purposes. Alright, so now I'm going to look towards the diagnostic criteria here. And basically what I'm going to do with this, kind of what I did with that first page I just showed here, I'm going to just be raising a lot of questions, and some of these questions will just be left open-ended, and I'm not going to specifically answer them. It'll just be questions for you to ponder on your own. Some of them I will be answering, though. So here we go. Alright, so first looking at the criteria here for gender dysphoria in children. So it mentions here a 6-month duration. For children, there is a total of 8 possible criteria that they can meet. So the first one deals with a very general statement about being some other gender from what was assigned at birth. It's a pretty vague and flexible criteria in that it could be either surrounding social aspects or physical aspects surrounding sexual characteristics. So then we look here and we see that 2 through 6 deal with all social aspects. And it's only when we get to 7 and 8 that we are dealing with the physical aspects surrounding sexual characteristics. And so for this criteria, at least 6 of the following must be met to be diagnosed. And so most combinations of any of the chosen 6 criteria here will all include at some point both social and physical aspects surrounding sexual characteristics, most combinations. However, there is one that could include just social aspects if it's just going to include the first 6. So number 1 here, I'll just read it. A strong desire to be of the other gender, or an insistence that one is the other gender, or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. That could be interpreted as just purely social if the individual meets with the 6 of the following being like the first 6. Alright, so now looking at the entry for adolescents and adults. So it's the same thing here where it has to be at least 6 months duration. There is only a total of 6 possible criteria this time. Looking here, we can see the first 3 deal with all physical aspects surrounding sexual characteristics, and then the last 3 actually deal with social aspects. So at least 2 of the following criteria must be met to be diagnosed for adolescents and adults, as compared to the 6 from the 8 list for children. So later in the manual, it does state that very often experienced gender correlates with a desire for other sexual characteristics. But what's interesting for the adolescents and adults is that looking on the criteria on its own and putting together multiple combinations, there can be a possibility for many adolescents and adults having their gender dysphoria or identity be either primarily about physical characteristics, be primarily about social aspects, or a mix of both. Alright, so now I want to move on to the questioning surrounding all this. I'm genuinely surprised by the rigidity and the specificity of this criteria for children compared to the open-endedness for adults. I believe how specific it is for children. I believe it's reflective of something dangerous, very essentialist, and heavily reliant on a binary for kids, and something that is painfully conforming. And to be honest, I've been able to find multiple exceptions to some of the roots of the criteria points for like 2 through 6, like the criteria that are mostly dealing with social aspects. Especially as I grew out of childhood, I was always able to find exceptions of it that broke down my own conceptions about gender. So yeah, I'll just speak from personal experience now. So we see in this criteria like clothing, toys, games, activities, playmates, they're all like policed within this criteria. And I personally see this as like policing as a freedom of expression. I think it's sad. But yeah, just speaking from personal experience, I knew of like one student leader in high school who occasionally cross-dressed, and he didn't identify as trans. Like he would just wear dresses from time to time without, second guessing himself. Let's see. And yeah, I'm surprised by like emphasis on like playmates of the other gender. Can it be more encouraged and considered well-rounded growing up as children to have playmates of any gender as a kid? And like this statement of like rough and tumble play, like that's so 1950s from my perspective. How is that statement playing into a reflection of what is valued and dominated more within masculine norms? What are even typical games, toys, activities for the other gender anyways? How could this be changing as time is going on, possibly? How is this informed by capitalist advertising? It definitely is, Cross-gender roles in make-believe play or fantasy play. I've known many cis gay men who can play Beyonce dancing impersonations harder than I ever could, and I always considered Beyonce like hyper-feminine. I don't know. Across my life, I have unintentionally, by chance, I've been able to befriend cis guys who grew up with single moms for a long period of time, and they emulated a lot of their feminine sensitive social cues from her. Are we to consider like these men cross-gender role-playing because they took some of those cues from their mom? So now let's move on to the vagueness of the criteria for adolescents and adults. So it's interesting to note that for children, it has social aspects at the top of the list and then bodily aspects at the bottom. And for adults, it's actually vice versa. And it has physical aspects for adolescents and adults, then social at the bottom. I'm wondering if this is a way that it's like implicitly prioritizing physical aspects more for adults. And so it moves to adolescents and adults for social aspects to be clouded in really vague terms here. So like to be a gender, to be treated as a gender, conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of a gender. So, that leads to one interesting question, like conviction of typical feelings and reactions of a gender. Are they right in that conviction? Like, I totally believe there are many adults that are right with how they see how gender roles have affected people. But anyways, this vagueness in language could be a reflection of two things. One is that of gender roles being so internalized, microaggressed, and unquestioned. It could be reflective of that. Another is societal enforcements in certain areas of the world or in the country through direct harassment and violence, policing folks to a certain gender. The adult criteria might be able to be seen as less restricting, especially because you only had to like have 2 of these to be considered gender dysphoric. And it could be anything from body to social or both. But is the vagueness a lack of ability to really question the roles and the various effects it has had on people in adulthood and adolescence? Is the vagueness in language complacency with mass socialization, internalization, microaggressions, or harassment? I guess that makes sense why it has to be cloud in this language, because this is a statistical manual, but I'm just saying that's reflective of what it is for gender conformity. And another interesting question to ponder is how can all of this vary with race and class norms? You know, it's really funny because very often I hear the dialogue of a trans woman saying that, oh, you know, I always wore dresses as a kid, or I'd always like get in my mother's shoes and heels and I'd want to play with her makeup. And then I will see people that are so quick to jump down her throat and say, oh, well, that doesn't define your womanhood. That's not what being a girl is about. And it's like, okay, but do you see how dependent this criteria is on social aspects? Do you see that when she is saying this, she is just telling you one aspect of the bigger picture towards her gender identity? She still has the right to say that because she is saying this in the face of a gender-conforming world. Being gender conformity, you know, being positioned in power structures as what's important in society. So now let's move on to what was more of the defining language for all of this, even as we acknowledge like the flexibility with all this language. So the defining factors, what makes these folks different, even though we can find exceptions for so many of these rules, especially for children, is just the quantifier of strong. That's the only thing. Strong is the big adjective here in describing desires, preferences, rejections, dislikes, and convictions. And so that really leads to a question for people that are diagnosed with gender dysphoria. What does strong look like for every individual person? I believe that's really the root of what could be one's gender dysphoria, as how strength is defined, and for their gender identity as well. Like, how is strength subjective in this case, though? Is the quantifier of strong purely by one's own psychological predisposition? Or is it manifested as strength because of strict enforcement of gender conformity and cisnormativity in society still going on, and the tensions that individual is facing? Is that why the quantifier strong and strength is being used, you know? What I see here in this criteria that's interesting is still a lot of difficulty separating gender roles, expressions, and identities, even though within discourse we say like roles and expressions are different from identity. And so I very much question this criteria, where I think, what would happen if society moved towards not enforcing roles and expressions? Is it possible for society to move in that way? I hear many trans people say all the time that they had to separate the idea of being masculine and being feminine from a desire to be male or to be female, or just pretty much separating the social aspects from wanting certain physical changes. I wonder if they would feel the same if this wasn't an idea they had to separate. I do know a lot of trans folks that say they would feel the same even if they didn't have to go through the experience of trying to separate the two. But I also know some trans folks that said like they wouldn't feel the same as well, and I believe that statement is worth considering as well. So sometimes I question if like the many criteria on social aspects, if it is distracting, should the primary motivation to have this in the DSM-5 in the first place, should it be just helping with the HRT and surgeries, and should that be minimized in this? Or should it still be there, though, because gender roles are often attached to one's survival for being in the world? It's a very internalized aspect about our self-survival that could qualify the idea of someone establishing an identity for themselves. Last thing I want to end with this specific examination of the diagnostic criteria. So just the combinations that could lead to the idea of someone being non-binary. So first question, so the meeting gender dysphoria for at least 6 months. What if these feelings are not meeting the 6 months duration? And what if it's still being experienced at the same intensity for, say, binary trans people? What if these strong feelings are fluctuating for half this period of time, or monthly, or weekly, or daily? Do they still deserve attention? How could they be left out of this diagnostic criteria if that's the experience that they're having? And as I've often found is the case with gender fluid people. Can these feelings of fluctuation be affected socially and still tied in? Like, how about children or adolescents that enjoy both the activities, clothing, playmates that are stereotyped as masculine or feminine without contradiction or second-guessing themselves? Because that was what it felt like for me in childhood before I became very involved in music. Like, I interacted in ways that could have been stereotyped as both masculine and feminine. You know, I had friends that most of my friends in kindergarten were girls. I didn't really like sports growing up, but I loved Legos, and that was stereotyped as masculine. And I did find mastery in the sport of karate after like years of training. I got my black belt when I was like age 14, which I don't know could be considered masculine. So there's the question of how selective and specific can individual people be with their desired sexual anatomy. How about people that experience the criteria point for a dislike of sexual anatomy, but not the strong desire for other sexual characteristics? We do see here that those are two separate points, so they're not one and the same. Or what if it's, vice versa, where it's, a strong desire for other sexual characteristics, but they don't have the dislike of sexual anatomy. Does the criteria can definitely allow for this, because you can actually get combinations where you don't have the dislike and the desire paired together. And that makes me curious, like how, again, going back to this quantifier of strength, how can this change the subjectivity of a quantified strength in this? Like, if one person is to experience like the strong dislike, but they don't experience the strong desire, then like how do they move forward in life with those disliking feelings? Do they just live with that condition, or do they develop a different mindset that can back them away from those feelings of dislike? All right, so that's my analysis of the DSM-5. So just to wrap this video up, I'm really glad I was able to get through grad school and complete my Master's of Arts in Teaching. I'm very excited for my career as a school teacher and happy to be representing as a genderqueer school teacher and someone who is openly nonconforming. Education is a primary place of becoming socialized, and I believe that gender nonconforming people on staff and the students are really important for the community to be allowed to just be themselves. You know, for people that are trans, I believe like the ability to be gender nonconforming can really help people sort through some of the difficult questions I was asking about the statistical manual. For people that are trans, I feel like it can help them just really lead the way for what they can need in life, all the way from social changes to HRT and surgeries if they need to go there. You know, for people that are not trans, I think that representation can better enable them to broaden their social possibilities for how they engage in the world. It can lessen the ingrained idea that something has to be interpreted in a gender role first before getting determined for having a positive value judgment. And just seeing that fellow trans people are just being themselves can help and just enable them to be themselves. So those are all my thoughts. I hope you're having a lovely weekend wherever you are, and just know that you are loved. Bye. That hard again, that wasn't. There we go, that's more visible. Wait. Angle it. Perfect. Okay. Bye.